After I've finished quilting the background, I'm ready to add the pockets here. But before I do that, I needed to trim off the sides. I like to draw a line using my ruler just to make sure that I've got everything where it belongs, and then I will trim that off. Now that I've trimmed off the excess, I'm ready to add the pockets. Every time you quilt a quilt, sometimes it'll suck up fabric in one direction and maybe not the other. That's why you need to trim it to make it nice and square. So I place the pockets below the tree in order. So I need to make sure that there's a little space between the pockets so that I can put little goodies in there. And I also need to make sure that these are centered. So after I lay them down and I say, oh, okay, that's looking pretty good. Maybe an easy measurement for me would be that the bottom pocket's going to go exactly 3 inches from the edge. And then I might say, oh, let's see, this is 3 3/4 on this side. This is, oh, almost 3 3/4. So I might decide exactly where the center is and fool around with those measurements. And then I'm ready to pin them. So I've pinned my bottom pocket here. Notice where I've put the pins, close to the numbers or between the numbers, because when I take this to the sewing machine, I'm going to sew about an eighth of an inch around the edge here, all the way to this side. And then after I sew that on, I'm going to sew these lines here. And so I don't want to have to repin every time I sew. So the first time I need to make sure I stick the pins where I'm not going to sew. So I've got the first one in place, and I'm going to use this one to put the other ones in place. And I've decided that I'm going to put about 1.5 inches between each pocket. And that way I've got a little space between the tree and the pockets, and I've got space to put things inside the pockets. Your measurements might be a little bit different depending on the size of your hands. So maybe it's a smaller quilt or a larger quilt, and maybe you've decided that you want larger pockets because you've got bigger items to put in. So these measurements that I'm giving you are what I'm using on this quilt, but every Advent quilt I've made, the measurements have been different. It's basically what's pleasing to my eye and what's going to work to make those pockets functional. So now I have everything pinned. I like to double check with my ruler just to make sure that everything's where it needs to be. I've also decided to put an extra pin at the corner because this is where I'm going to start, and it's going to be where I'm going to stop. And when I do that, I'm going to go back and forth to lock my stitches there. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew around the edges. Every time I start and stop, I need to lock my stitches. On these also, when I do the lines in between. I'm just going to use a regular stitch. I can use my walking foot to do this, or if you're more comfortable with just a regular foot, that would probably work okay. So I finished sewing all the pockets on, and I wanted to show you a little trick that I've used. Instead of sewing each one of these sections, what I like to do is I start here and I go down this way. The reason why I like to start at the bottom and go down is because when I'm sewing, it's pushing the fabric this way, as opposed to if I'm sewing this way, sometimes the fabric gets bunched up down here in the corner. So I start here, lock the stitches, sew, lock the stitches, and instead of clipping my threads at this point, I just move on down to the next one. Here's my thread. I haven't clipped it. And I stitch, back stitch, come down, back stitch, do the same thing, move to the next one, stitch this, and then I jump over to this row. Notice this long piece of thread here, and I do the same thing. This makes it much easier. So like right now, I'm ready to clip these. It's much easier to clip them after it's been done rather than to put your hands down, pick up your scissors, and so forth. So this Advent quilt is almost complete. I just need to trim this, add the binding and the buttons, and then stuff the pockets.